Okay, the second condition that helped foster the American Revolution was the Enlightenment and its impact on the American mind. So take note of that. The Enlightenment and its impact on the American mind. And this will make sense in just as we proceed through this section of the learning objective. The Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, as it's sometimes referred to, was a product of the writings of the liberal political philosophers of Europe, like this individual right here, John Locke. All right, John Locke, take note of him. John Locke is going to have an incredible influence on the Revolutionary era, on the document of the Declaration of Independence, and the very structure of the Constitution. So definitely make his name part of your second-hand understanding of American history. So these philosophers of Europe had an impact on the minds of Americans' intellectual leaders, the revolutionary leaders, as we'll get to in just a second. It reinforced the practical experience of the American environment. So take note of that too. Let me repeat that. It reinforced the practical experience of the American environment as it applied reason to the authoritarian institutions and people. So really take note of that, and we'll get to that in, as we proceed through this part of the learning objective. So as we'll discuss with the Declaration of Independence, as a result of the Enlightenment, people began to envision a universe based on impersonal, scientific laws that govern the behavior of all manner, that they lived in a universe which was controlled in all of its manifestations by the laws of nature and nature's God. So this is important to really understand this aspect of it. So God is not out of the picture. This isn't the age of atheism at this point, but it is a depersonalizing who or what God is at this point, right? And a lot of these people would be known as what's referred to as deists, like Thomas Jefferson. Right? It's not a rejection of God, it's not a rejection of Christianity, but it's a way of understanding natural phenomena as part that can be understood through science. And indeed, what's really important about the Enlightenment is to understand that it was basically piggybacking off the scientific revolution. So let's take a look at that to further understand first what the Enlightenment was and is, and to understand how the environment, as we looked at before, influenced the Enlightenment. So the scientific revolution was kicked off by this individual right here, Nicholas Copernicus. And so judging by this picture here, maybe what you've known about him, what is it that he is most famous for? Before him, this is what basically the universe looked like, right? Earth in the center and everything else flowing around it, which makes sense. If you look out into the sky, into the night sky, it looks like, it appears that everything is flowing around us, right? And again, what Copernicus was able to demonstrate is indeed this is what the universe appears to be, right? With Earth as one of many objects out into the night sky, in fact, revolving around the sun, instead of the sun and everything else revolving around us. So what's interesting about Nicholas Copernicus, and this is somewhat of an aside, but it's an important point to understand, is how he went about putting out his findings. So Nicholas Copernicus is living at a time when the Catholic Church is under some serious distress. It's somewhat the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Church is under a lot of scrutiny. It's being accused of a lot of corruption. Europe is in a lot of instability, right? So the Catholic Church is quite sensitive to any kind of detraction from doctrine. And doctrine indeed included this view of the universe, the earth and everything evolving around the sun, around the earth, I mean, right, including the sun. So what he did is that through his calculations, now he did this before the telescopes were around, so he was able to demonstrate this through calculus and geometry. And anybody who understands the language of calculus and geometry, looking at his findings, could understand that he was absolutely correct. It would be Galileo and other astronomers and scientists that would confirm through visual evidence using the telescope that indeed Nicholas Copernicus was correct. But what he did was to avoid the very real threat of going against doctrine back then, which would have been being brought forward through the Inquisition, he published his findings after his death. And so this is very interesting in what he did here. Basically what he did was that he published it and he said to the Catholic Church, deal with it. You cannot make me recant because I am dead. And so if he had published it when he was alive, there's a very real possibility, just being a human being, wanting to avoid pain and suffering, that he would have said, yes, my calculations were wrong. Please don't torture me anymore, or don't threaten to torture me, right? But he publishes it after his death. And so it is very much something that the Catholic Church is having to deal with, and other people following in his footsteps, like Galileo, are also going to be very interested in really testing the validity of this. And what this begins to do is it begins to unfold what is now known as the scientific method, right? So Nicholas Copernicus has a hypothesis. He says that his calculations demonstrate it, and people follow in his footsteps to repeat his calculations and may come at his hypothesis from different perspectives using different measurements. But again and again and again and again, the same conclusion is reached, that indeed, as far as our solar system is concerned, the sun is the center of the universe and the earth is revolving around that center. How this relates to the Enlightenment is that basically the Enlightenment writers were interested in political and ethical and moral discourse using what the scientists, these early scientists like Copernicus or Galileo or Newton were using. They were using reason to understand natural phenomena rather than relying on tradition, rather than relying on mythical stories like that of Genesis, right? If you wanted to know how the earth began prior to the scientific revolution in European society, well, it's right there on page 1, right? God created the heavens and the earth, period, right? So scientists are beginning to unpack this and create a little bit more nuance by using reason, by looking at the available evidence and going, this is the way it actually appears. So enlightened thinkers like John Locke are going to apply reason to political institutions, right? How do we know who is in charge? And how should somebody be in charge of political discourse and political execution of laws? Prior to the Enlightenment era, prior to the American Revolution, it was very much, although you have the beginnings of democratic institutions with parliaments, still the king holds a lot of sway over the political discourse and political execution, meaning how laws are executed, which is based on the whole notion of divine right of king. So what people like John Locke are going to do is they're going to theorize that, wait a minute, we have to have a government, right? That means we have to have authority. But the idea of people being in authority based on this principle of divine right of king defies reason. How do we know how anybody is in charge of anybody? These are very sensitive issues. The whole point of society, as he would put it, is for people to so John Locke would argue that people have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and estate, or property, as it's also known as, right? And so this is interesting. One, you could obviously see the absolute influence on the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson is going to change this inalienable right to life, liberty, and estate, or property to happiness. And we'll talk more about that later when we get to the Declaration of Independence. But basically what John Locke is saying here is that human beings have a right to live a life. Right? They have a right within that life to be free, and they have a right to pursue a state, property, or wealth. Right? They have that right, and that's what a government should be able to empower people to do. And if they're not doing that, if there are individuals within that government that are preventing human beings from pursuing life, liberty, and property, then that government is illegitimate. Right? So we can use reason by saying, okay, well, what is a human being? A human being is this. It is a thing that lives. It is a thing that wants to be free, and it's a thing that wants stuff. Right? Property. And so because we want all of that, that's basically essential to what it means to be a human, John Locke is arguing. And anything that gets in the way of that, individuals that get in the way with that because they believe they have the power to do so by reason, is defying that, right? And so since people have a tendency, in authority, have a tendency to abuse power, John Locke would argue is that we must have reasonable ways that we all agree on to how people get into power and how people get out of power, and the extent of what that power must mean, right? And so this is translated into what we commonly understand as democratic principles. So we understand today that the president can only serve 2 terms. Now, that wasn't originally in the Constitution. That's something that came about after FDR was president, Roosevelt was president. But we all understand that if for some reason Barack Obama today said, I'm going to be president for life, we would understand that that would be wrong. And he would there would be something significantly wrong with his outlook on power. And we also understand that each term is 4 years. And so a person can only be president for 2 years, or for 8 years, 2 terms at 8 years. We also understand how that person gets into power. He's voted for through a tallying up of the popular vote, which translates into this very strange thing called the Electoral College. We'll take a look at that. But despite the weirdness of the Electoral College, it's something that we all agree on as something to a degree that's reasonable enough to understand who should be in power, who should not be in power. So despite the disappointments of some people that Mitt Romney wasn't president, we all understood why Mitt Romney wasn't president, right? They didn't have to duke it out literally and have soldiers fight on their behalf to see who was going to be president. We didn't have to have people understand their interpretation of how God ordained them to be in charge, and for everybody to be kind of on board with that, right? This is a purely secular, non-religious decision. So this is what John Locke brings to the table. So how does this apply to the environment? Well, John Locke's writings were done in basically theory in the confines of England, which was very much still immersed in divine right of king, which was very much immersed in nobility and power through hereditary. Even though they were playing with democratic principles, it's still a very much long shot with what would develop in the United States later on. How the American colonies began to actualize people like John Locke's theory is due to the American environment with the rich resources and the initial lack of hierarchy, and giving individuals a stake in society that they wanted to preserve in in a fashion that reflected the environment in which that wealth was born into. And so it's often argued that without that, again, the vast and abundant resources that produced wealth for individuals in the colonial period, the Enlightenment, the actualization of enlightened principles as posed by John Locke, would probably have taken a lot longer to manifest themselves throughout humanity if they ever would have in the first place. It took that American environment within the context of salutary neglect, the lack of hierarchy, for these principles to be unleashed. So make sure you understand that that's really what's important about the Enlightenment, right? And how it applies to the American Revolution. The American Revolution, again, doesn't begin in 1776. The American Revolution begins in 1609, right? Through this process of salutary neglect of these colonies being able to develop on their own within the context of an environment of vast resources that are abundant, that are cheap, that are giving individuals who are gaining power an ability to shape the very structures of political institutions that are going to benefit them, and as they see it, are going to benefit all of humanity. So again, very, very interesting how the Enlightenment has such a huge influence on the American mind, and it's something to keep in mind too. This process of Nicholas Copernicus unleashing into the planet. You can almost see why the Catholic Church would want to keep a lid on it, right? So this was once time. This right here was once our view of the universe, right? Nice, safe, static. The Earth doesn't move. It's in the center of the universe. To this, indeed, the Earth is not static. It's moving, and it's not the center of the universe. In fact, it shares the center with other heavenly bodies out in the Earth, other planets and other stars, to this understanding of what the universe is today. So here's the Earth, right? And here's where we are within the context of the solar system. Pretty standard. This is what Copernicus would basically understand. But as we move out into the solar interstellar neighborhood, we see that there are other solar systems within those heavenly stars that Copernicus really had no idea what this was about. So we're, later in astronomy, we begin to find out that we're one of many, many solar systems out in the sky. And then as astronomers apply the scientific method over generations to generations, our understanding of what the universe further expands. So this is the Milky Way with millions and millions of solar systems within it, just like ours, and possible other planets that could possibly be like ours. Wow, huge, amazing, right? But then we begin to develop more sophisticated tools of observing the observable universe. And we begin to find out that we are one of many, many galaxies that are out here. Here are just a few of the galaxies, but there seems to be millions upon millions of these galaxies, which would mean that there are billions of solar systems out there, and maybe possibly trillions of planets, possibly millions of planets just like ours, the planet Earth, right? And then we begin to see that these galaxies are out in what are called superclusters, right? And we are just in one sort of supercluster itself. This is actually the Virgo supercluster, which we're just finding out now that is a neighboring supercluster that is not even part of our supercluster, right? At all. All right. Here we see other superclusters, and again, a supercluster is the makeup of a supercluster is thousands upon millions of different galaxies, just like ours, right? Or maybe not just like ours, something radically different. And then if we expand further now of our understanding, the observable universe, right? So all of this, where this is pointing to in the context of this huge supercluster of galaxies, is in the context of this. Right? So our planet is somewhere lost within as a speck, right, in there, right? Our little planet, everything that happens here is happening within the context of this, what we could actually see, meaning about 14 billion years, light years, 14 billion light years of the expansion of the universe. This is basically all we can possibly see of the universe at this point right now. So I just bring all of this up because it is kind of interesting if you think about what the scientific revolution has unleashed in the collective kind of understanding of where we are within the universe. It could begin to explain in part, a major contributor to the degree of anxiety most are feeling on the planet right now. Again, we used to be a very safe, static planet in which the heavens used to evolve around us in the hands of a very loving God. And now, and from there, right, we began to become unsettled that we weren't a Earth-centric universe. We were a heliocentric universe, meaning a sun-centric universe, to something that we can't even begin to fathom where we are within the universe. So people are looking for a more stable, concrete, less transient idea of the universe. And so it's not a coincidence that the fastest rising sects of each major religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, are fundamentalists, right? Are extremists, people wanting to go back to where we were once, resting on solid ground. That's not. We understand that that's not a fact anymore. That we are just here. This is it. This is a possibility, even for the faithful, that's a very real possibility, that we are out here alone on our own, and we must deal with that reality of how insignificant we are within the context of the universe. It does cause a great deal of anxiety. I want to leave us with this clip right here, a very interesting clip from the late Carl Sagan, to kind of close out this the influence of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment.
From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest. But for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization. Every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on the mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they can become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatred is. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the only home we've ever known, the pale blue dot.